Hello and welcome to our next podcast series, The Impact of Voice, Women in International Relations in Academia. I'm Tanya Spisbar, the Director of the Australia-India Institute in New Delhi. There have been a number of exciting changes and developments in 2020 alone, and largely in the space of international relations. COVID has impacted the way in which the world now interacts and has caused quite dynamic changes within the Indo-Pacific region. We've also seen the announcement of Kamala Harris, for example, the first woman of Indian origin to be voted as running mate for Joe Biden, who could potentially become the next Vice President of the United States of America. We've also seen in recent weeks India having been voted onto the UN Commission of Women, which again is a hopeful development that there'll be more participation of women in leadership. However, what often gets overlooked is women's participation in international relations in academia. The reason this is important is because who gets to speak impacts narrative, impacts theory, and impacts discourse. At an international event at the beginning of this year, I had the pleasure of being at the Raisina Dialogue, one of the most extraordinary international events organised by ORF in India, the Observer Research Foundation. The theme this year was on strongman politics, and it again struck me that we are not shy of using masculine discourse in international relations, but do shy away from words like kindness, compassion, empathy in international relations, which arguably in the 21st century could draw us closer together to address the shared challenges that we face. To explore this at a deeper level with experts, we are fortunate enough to have with us Dr. Carla Winston, Erin Watson-Lynn, and Sylvia Mishra. I will introduce each of them in turn and then hand over to our moderator today, who is Parul Nada, our very own from the Australia-India Institute in Delhi. Parul is a PhD scholar of international relations at the JNU in her own right. She is working on the impact of ceasefire violations on the life of people living in the border areas of Jammu. Her areas of interest include war studies, gender and international relations theory, and security studies. Dr. Carla Winston is a lecturer at the University of Melbourne in international relations. She has previously taught at the University of Victoria in Canada and at the University of British Columbia, where she obtained her PhD. Carla's work relates to international relations theory, norms and norm diffusion, human rights and transitional justice, peace and conflict, and the uses of popular culture in politics and international affairs. Erin Watson-Lynn is now based in Melbourne. She is a foreign affairs advisor whose clients include universities, think tanks, and governments. Erin was previously a senior fellow at the Perth US Asia Centre at the University of Western Australia, and before that, Director of Asia Link Diplomacy at the University of Melbourne. Erin started her career in academia as a lecturer and researcher at Monash University and Swinburne University of Technology, as well as having a role at UNESCAP in New Delhi. Erin is currently Australia's head delegate to Women's 20 in Saudi Arabia this year. We also, and lastly, I'm introducing Sylvia Mishra because she'll be our first speaker today. Ms. Mishra is a doctoral researcher at the Department of Defence Studies in King College London, and her research focuses on nuclear strategy and non-proliferation, South Asian security, and emerging and disruptive technologies. She chairs the CBRN Working Group for Women of Colour Advancing Peace and Security, the Indian Women in International Relations and Global Policy Insights, and is a mid-career cadre scholar at CSIS. We are introducing Sylvia today because as the founder of Indian Women in International Relations Forum, one of her primary roles is to provide a voice for Indian women in international relations. I'll now turn over to Parul to moderate this session.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you everyone for being here. Sylvia, what was your motivation for starting the IWIR Forum? I mean, what was the need there to raise the voice of women in international relations? And in your personal experience, have you ever experienced a bias against Indian women in particular?
Thank you so much for the question and having me on board over here. So as we know, over time, a lot of business studies and also the International Monetary Fund studies have shown that women in the corporate sector or even in the banking or regulatory boards, just having greater diversity of thought and ideas have resulted in better outcomes and better policy policy initiatives at different businesses and corporates. However, when it comes to the national security arena or the policy making field, we see that there's a striking gap in terms of gender representation, and this has been the case for several years. It's changing. However, this gap is also self-sustaining. It has started with the lack of representation, or also like the focus of women scholars in international relations. So it was imperative that deliberate steps are taken to dismantle the status quo. This is a self-sustaining vicious cycle, and several steps needs to be taken to essentially break this status quo. Therefore, in today's complex and challenging world, which requires a diversity of thoughts in when it comes to policy making, it is of essence that women, and especially women of color, are also able to talk and discuss about issues that impacts them. And pretty much this was the reason why my co-founder Arpit Chaturvedi and myself decided to launch the Indian Women in International Relations initiative at the Global Policy Insight. One of our core objective is also to mentor younger women in this policy arena. Widening the aperture is extremely important when it comes to foreign policy making issues, and therefore with certain goals of essentially spotlighting the work of Indian women in international sphere essentially guided our motivation. When you talk about a little bit of personal experience, I started off my career working on foreign policy issues, and I used to study India-US foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region. However, one important aspect of India-US policy was the focus on nuclear issues. And when I started working more on nuclear policy issues, I was often told that nuclear weapons or like the hard security issues is essentially a very technical field and meant for a more like male scholars. So yes, often we are told there are certain things that is just like not for us, and one just has to keep on breaking several glass ceilings at every step. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that. I completely agree with your perspective on how diversity is important in every aspect, and especially when policy making is concerned. So thank you for stressing on that. My next question is to Carla. Carla, as an academic and as a woman in academics, there's always this concern about underrepresentation of women, and this is across disciplines. And it's not just about in terms of representation of women in faculty positions, but it's also about women work being referenced, or their works being included in the syllabus. Do you think this is across board in international relations, or is it specific to traditional security studies versus non-traditional security studies?
I'd say there is a problem with equity across the board, but it's more pronounced in certain areas, including security, where Sylvia works, in technology-related issues, where we tend to think in gendered terms that are traditionally considered masculine, like war or like relative power relations or technology issues, or things that are considered hard politics or hard political science. It's less of an issue if you get into what are gendered terms considered softer or more human focused sides of IR. So the work that you're doing, Parul, on how ordinary people's lives are impacted by conflict is a more gendered and more feminist approach to doing IR. And in those fields, including mine, I do international norms, the gender balance is much closer to 50-50, if not in some areas majority women. So across the board, there is an issue with citation, with publishing in major academic presses and journals that's, if getting better very, very slowly, but it doesn't look the same in all areas of IR.
And what do you think could be done, to change this? Is there something that you feel like, as a fellow academic, like Sylvia started this forum and she's pushing it hard? And
That's one way. So there are a lot of efforts amongst women to promote each other and promote each other's work and to provide sets of checks and balances, really. So there's a fantastic tool for checking the gender balance of your syllabus that you can just go online and plug in your syllabus and see. There's a number of websites such as Women Also Know and POC Also Know that are meant to collect contact information and identification of women and POC scholars so that journalists can find them, so that other scholars can find them to use research to do, partnered research. There are networks of women in international studies in lots and lots of countries, including Australia, not just India, although India certainly needs one. And there are women's caucuses at all of the major big conferences where mentorship and peer strategies for getting ahead, navigating the leaky pipeline, dealing with gender and power issues in your university and department, all of these things are happening, and they do have some buy-in from men. It's just that we are overcoming such a huge barrier given the origin of the field itself, and given that gender norms writ large in the world aren't changing as quickly as we'd like. They're also not changing as quickly as we'd like within the academy.
Thank you, Carla, for that. And when you mentioned that, there's certain fields where the balance is much better, it's also assumed, when a woman is working in international relations. So this is my question for Erin, because she is, a commentator on global affairs, and her work is not just limited to gender. I mean, she does cover gender, but it's not all about gender. So do you feel that women are more often assumed, Erin, to be working in the field of gender issues?
Not necessarily more broadly in IR, but what I found in my experience is that, so yes, I do on one hand work on a lot of gender issues. That's been a thread throughout my career when I started working in academia and through to think tanks. And it's something that I'm passionate about and interested in and have expertise in. But at the same time, what you find is that women get pushed into more gendered areas. So even if you're not talking about gender issues, say, as we all know, putting together a conference or a panel or something like that, you say, oh, I need a female panelist, or I need a female moderator. So we're going to get her to do the sustainability and environment one. You don't ever get asked to come and talk about or come and moderate a panel on maritime disputes in the South China Sea. And there are great women experts who work in that. But as someone who's seen that side of how these things are pushed around, the women get very women issues, more emotive issues, sustainability, the environment, not the more hard issues in international relations, which I find quite interesting, because if you look at some amazing women who do work on these hard security issues and do it just as brilliantly as the men next to them. So I do find that quite interesting. It's almost like we have our own bias in where women belong in that space, even when we're trying to do the right thing and bring more women into the conversation. And I think that's something I've observed over several years.
Thank you for that, Erin, and especially when you say that they're extremely intelligent and women with great knowledge in, say, the hard politics field, or say security studies or war. And Sylvia here, she specifically is working in that area of international relations. And, she started by saying that, how it's important to bring diversity. So do you think that it's a question open to all? Do you think that greater female representation has, in fact, driven the discourse has made the discourse wider in terms of how the world is seen today? And do you think a greater participation of women is going to change how the world is seen, or how international politics is seen?
I hope so. I mean, part of the problem with women's representation in a field that is not already equal is that it actually takes sort of a supermajority for discourse to really change, for people to get out of their preconceived mindsets, for women to be able to do work that isn't already preconceived to have a gendered lens to it. So if we had a room full of 5 nuclear technology scholars and they were all women, you could have a fantastic, theoretic, really fantastic, interesting conversation. But if it's half women and half men, the conversation is more likely to be taken over by men in terms of speaking time or in terms of number of interruptions, right? So the balance actually has to be more than 50-50 before our ingrained notions of how we should be behaving starts to go away.
I think Carla is absolutely right. And at any session, you can have, a number of female experts in the room, and they'll often, this is obviously anecdotal, but you see it, you observe it all the time where you think, well, hang on, you're the expert, but you've just had 3 men who are not experts even in that topic dominate a conversation. And it's terribly frustrating. And the thing about a lot of women is they will just sit back and go, oh, whatever, I'll write a great article about it later. Because what's the point in that sort of taking part in that argument, if you will, in that way. So you see this all the time. And of course that's going to then translate to, the broader representation, the way that, women are represented across the field. It just, of course that, if that's how it plays out on sort of a day-to-day level in the field, then of course that's going to influence more broadly.
I'll also take a go at that question. I think I completely agree with what both Carla and Erin said. A very simplistic answer to your question is the reason why it is important for women to have equal representation in national security issues is something that is impacts, like national security and foreign policy decision making is something that impacts everyone, right? So women, when they constitute 50% of the population, they have an equal right to talk about and discuss and have a seat at the table about policies which actually impacts them. And I would go on further to make the case that, issues of war and peace adversely affects women more, women and children more than men. When we are talking about the nuclear policy issues, nuclear weapons or studies have shown that the effects of radiation impacts women more adversely than men. So when we are talking and taking into account some of these criteria, it's extremely crucial that women do have a seat at the table about devising and formulating policies that actually impact their day-to-day life. Yes, I think a greater representation of women in these arenas would substantially change the contours and also the complexion of policies in the years ahead. And that's why I think concerted efforts should be made for a greater gender parity in some of these critical arenas. Yeah, I stop there.
Thank you so much for all of your opinions on this. And I think one thing which all of us have noticed in this pandemic is that, women leaders have really outshone, they have performed way better than their male counterparts. However, in Australia, the treatment of Australia's first prime minister has left this fear in the major parties. And Australia is not ready for another female prime minister, maybe. And even in India, after Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, we haven't seen another candidate for a female prime minister. And in the US, we saw Hillary Clinton lose, and now finally we have Kamala Harris. And I would really want Sylvia to comment on that, especially because you're there, you're in the US, and you're experiencing this. But if this is a question in general for everyone, do you feel that we have reached a position where women leaders, and their competence will not be judged based on their gender? She's a leader. It doesn't matter. It's a male. It's a female. Her competence is basically just what she does and what she brings to the table.
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in, I mean, so I'm, as you know, head delegate for the W20 in Saudi Arabia this year. If you look at the G20, once you take out Angela Merkel, and if you count the EU, you remove Ursula, I can't remember her surname right now, Ursula, once you remove them from the G, yeah, that's her, yeah, from the family photo. Sorry, my German is not that great. But once you remove those women from that photo, there are no women in the G20 family photo. And obviously Angela Merkel will no longer be there soon. We don't know who's going to be her successor. But when the 20, however you define most important economies in the world are together and you've got no women in there, that's a real problem. Because what we've seen this year is in the documents that came out of the G20, the first few documents, not one until an extraordinary digital ministers meeting took place was gender mentioned once, and it was only mentioned once. So it took several months into this pandemic for the G20 to even recognise the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 had on women, and it barely gets a look in now. And I've got to say that initially the Saudi Arabia presidency did do a really good job at trying to mainstream gender across the G20. So, but then when it came to a real crisis, was gender forefront? Absolutely not. And then I remember our delegation raised it with the government here and said, this is a real problem. Soon after, the Prime Minister started to talk about the negative impact of COVID-19 on women and how that was disproportionate, and that language has changed. It's also changed in the G20. But when that's the state of global politics or international relations or international policy making, like the preeminent body to deal with a crisis, nothing. And then when you look at it at a national level, Australia might be ready for another female Prime Minister, but there's no pipeline in Australian politics for the next Prime Minister. There are a number of really good people, but there's less women in the lower house than there are men. In the Senate, there's around equal representation, but as we know, Senate don't go on to be Prime Minister. So how can we even be ready if we don't even have the pipeline of ministers or the pipeline of backbenchers to go into those senior political positions?
Yeah, I mean, so the G20 is a big problem and their lack of gender diversity is a huge problem. Australia is a rarity in the world of IR for having both a female defense and foreign minister. So we don't have a female prime minister, but having a defense minister who's a woman is one of only, I think it's 20 or 22 in the world at the moment. Female foreign minister is a little bit more common, but having them both together, you would assume that Australia would pursue more gender inclusive or gender sensitive policy in the world. And that's true in some places and not in others. So Australia is currently finishing up its term on the UN Human Rights Council. And one of the things that it has actually focused on is women's rights and maternal and child relationships and rights having to do with the family, which is great, right? But when push comes to shove and there's an emergency, those voices get silenced again, and the recovery plans that we hear about, the cooperative plans we hear about, the sourcing of things doesn't have anything to do with gender. There's an ongoing discussion in poli-sci academic circles about the extent to which women leaders' experience in the pandemic is because they're women, or because the political systems that have produced women leaders are already more inclusive and already more interested in talking about traditionally gendered ideas like care and valuing that sort of work and thinking more robustly about what the economy is, not just construction and trades. And so that the underlying political will to do things that focus more on the gendered impacts of COVID already exists regardless of which leader it is, so that states which have a good gender balance usually do well, and it's the states that have the strong men that are doing the crappy ones, because those leaders are incapable of listening to the gendered aspects or the gendered commentary or the input from, well, women that you might hope for. Donald Trump does not listen to women.
I personally feel that was a very poignant point that you made here about how that the society itself is ready and has brought a woman to the center in itself means that it is going to think beyond just trade and finances. And I think I think that's one of the most important points that it has come across today, because that puts the onus on all of us to evolve, and it's not just about this one particular person. There is what I feel is very significant. Sylvia, would you like to share your views on this?
Yeah, as an absolutely great points from Erin and Carla. I completely agree with a lot of the things that they have brought to the forefront. So the idea of women being judged in terms of even their leadership is or has been very systemic, right? And it is going to, unfortunately, in my opinion, carry on for the next foreseeable future. But essentially, like, when women add these leadership positions, like, I think it really boils down to what are the things that they are able to do, accumulating their experiences and how they utilize their voice and agencies in terms of lifting other women and in terms of pushing the conversation forward is important. I mean, look at Julia Gillard. I think she is doing a tremendous role in terms of developing a cohort of women leaders, essentially focused on strengthening the equities of women parliamentarians around the globe. And she is, I think, at the King's College, leading this Center for Women in Global Development and Leadership. So it is really important that how women are able to, who are in leadership position, are able to use their voice and agencies to push forward the conversation. So that is one. And second, you did mention the US presidential elections. Well, it is something that is of palpable excitement right now in the United States. And I think a lot of people, and especially people of color, women of color, and also the Indian American community, for the first time feel or has felt a sense of genuine representation. And it is incredible that we have like a woman, who is running for one of the most important offices in the United States. And well, also there are some whispers in the Washington corridors about possible defense women secretary of defense. I don't know, fingers crossed. So things are changing, and of course, like, when we have such women in leadership positions, a lot changes in terms of the direction and like the policy direction a country takes. However, it is definitely going to be challenging if one was following what the Biden campaign and his like bid to select a vice president nominee. He had already laid out early in the race that once he had received the nomination from the Democratic Party, that he's going to go ahead and choose a woman candidate. However, because there was so much of jockeying for power, like the op-ed pages, in, like, say, The Hill and several other important US dailies had such really demeaning profiles on like some of the women candidates, calling her, well, she's ambitious. Well, one of course has to be ambitious in order to reach the place where Kamala Harris or some of her equally competent contenders like Elizabeth Warren were. So I think some of these blind spots and biases would continue, but it is important, and it really comes down to us about how we utilize our voice and agencies to push the conversation forward. And the fact that today we are having this conversation today is also important, because it's so important to critically sensitize institutional policies on these matters.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that. And thank you all. I think this conversation is happening today, and that itself is a sign that, things are changing, and we have brilliant women in the panel. I'm not calling myself brilliant. I'm calling the rest of you for sure. And,
You are.
And and Tanya has joined us as well. And all of you, including Tanya, you all are women who work in IR. I would like to ask all of you, how has your experience been, and have you ever felt, that your gender had anything to do with how you were treated, or anything that just focused on your gender? Any experience?
I think given the part of IR that I work in, it's been less pronounced than I think Sylvia has it, to be perfectly honest. I work in an area of IR that is considered to be more feminized and has more women in it. So I've been able to benefit from some really fantastic senior women as mentors who have offered advice that is, not don't go for the big journals, don't go for the big jobs. There's also been good advice on thinking about work-life balance and career trajectories and all sorts of other questions like that. Where I do see it is in things like student evaluations, which continue to be, if unconsciously or consciously biased in various ways, which hurts women worse. And I see it occasionally in the amount of speaking time or the types of questions at conferences, and the male scholars, senior scholars who don't know me and don't know my work are still very invested in other forms of status and interest. But given the piece of IR that I occupy, it's not as pronounced as I would bet it is, as it is for others.
I'll jump in then. I think it's been a bit of both. So I've definitely felt at a disadvantage at times. And, day-to-day things like being walked past, people not introducing themselves, and then realizing I was sitting at the head of the table as the director. And my style is to just let them go, and then they can feel uncomfortable in a different moment when they figure it out. And I think that definitely is at the intersection of being young as well. So young women in leadership is a really hard thing for people to get their heads around still. So that being spoken over and all those kinds of things that happen, which don't tend to bother me too much. But to kind of counteract the more broad trend, like you, Carla, there's so many great networks of women. We went to Risina, which Tanya spoke about at the beginning, back in the beginning of the year in January, which was our last trip overseas. And, all of the women got a WhatsApp group, and we all had our own little caucus going on at the entire, the conference, and everyone was just adding in all the other women. So there's this real kind of solidarity that comes with being a woman in that kind of environment. At the same time, I know who the women leaders are in this sector who point to other women and actively look for other women when it comes to suggesting names for conferences, suggesting names for co-authors and all that kind of stuff. And that's a really active thing that goes on. Having said all of that, being a young woman at this point in time in the field also has its advantages because there is more cognizance of the bias. So people will look for people, and then you're at risk of being a quota person because often then you'll be asked to do things that are out of your depth or you don't have any expertise in, and you either need to rise to the challenge or sometimes sit back and say, look, I'm actually not qualified to do that, and perhaps suggest someone else. But it definitely has its advantages as well. So it's a bit of it's a bit of both sides at this point in time, but it's a very good time in that sense in the whole of history to be coming through. As a woman, I think the problem is like these conversations haven't changed. Like I'm reading Martha Gellhorn's book at the moment, about being a war correspondent and being a woman in that field. And it's like, in 50, 60 years, this has not changed. So are we having an impact and are we going to see some generational change? I think that's still a big question to be seen.
Can I also take a stab at that question?
Yeah.
Please, it's open to all.
So I found myself smiling and nodding when Carla and Erin were speaking, because I echo so many of some of their personal experiences. I think like we can all confidently say that we have been in like similar boats in terms of like being in conferences and like this little network group. I and thank you, as in really appreciate you sharing your personal experiences. So I grew up in a family where our dinner table conversations were about like Plato and like the philosopher king, because my father is a professor of international relations. But so it was very early on, like I was very steeped into learning about Western political thought and Indian political thought. And eventually when I embarked on my undergraduate studies in political science in Delhi University Hindu College, what really surprised me, and this is something that Carla also alluded to, this absolutely glaring absence of any women scholar in terms of sharing their perspective on international relations. So if you look at like the major theory and practice of international relations, they're all like predominantly Western, but also all white old men. So this this entire gap of looking at a feminism or a gendered lens of studying the state relations or state interrelations with other states is a huge gap in the literature when it comes to international relations. And that's why we also have seen like very important seminal work, this paper written by Fred Halliday on the hidden women in international relations. And unfortunately, even though things are changing extremely at a very gradual pace. And that is why it is extremely important to bolster the voices of women and women scholars, and especially of Indian origin and women of color who are working on international relations, both theory and practice. I've faced several challenges, from being said I should be passing over this conference invite to a male scholar, to all sorts of challenges about even how women scholar dress up in professional settings, the scrutiny on what she's wearing, how she's speaking, her diction, and especially when you're crossing over, I studied and lived and worked in Delhi, and then I crossed over to the United States. The obstacles and barriers were huge and challenging, but again, it is not all that bleak. It is extremely important to note that monumental shifts are happening, and it is happening because we are having these conversations. It has come into a sharper focus that deliberate steps and attempts needs to be taken to break this status quo. And that's why I'm extremely grateful for a lot of women mentors who are making this space and taking initiatives to make this space as inclusive and as possible. And that is why the only thing what we can do as scholars and practitioners in this field is keep on paying it forward and encourage like the younger and younger professionals, and especially women who are coming in this industry, to develop their human capital in terms of training them and providing them with a spotlight and being a role model in this arena. I'll stop there.
Thank you all. Tanya, I would request you to share your experience and, enlighten us, because you worked in the field as a diplomat. So that'll be interesting to hear.
Sure, Carol, and thank you for the invitation. So speaking or listening rather to the rest of you speak, I think my experiences have been quite similar. As a diplomat for 10 years with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, one thing that I noticed, and it's quite an unconscious bias at times, is the lack of role models. So you can work in a field and be almost unconscious of the fact that you almost accept that your minister is going to be male. It's almost given. The ambassadors or the high commissioners are by and large male. The secretary of the department is often male. And so this develops an unconscious bias where, because of the lack of role models, there can also be a self-limiting impact that happens as well, because it's just not available to think that there is, Erin spoke of a pipeline of having female representatives ready for leadership roles. Well, it's even hard to self-groom if the role model aspect isn't there to envisage oneself in that role. And again, we've been talking about change and the capability of change, and I'm really pleased to say that the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia is now a woman, Frances Adamson, incredibly capable. I worked to Harinder Sidhu, a fantastic and celebrated High Commissioner in Delhi, and again, excellent to have her and someone of Indian origin. And we've mentioned now that Australia's Trade Minister, Marise Payne, is also a woman. So these are some recent changes, and I think very welcome, because they also break that unconscious bias of level of acceptance and, you know, a sense of women's leadership participation in these sectors as well. I also think there's an issue when it comes to thematics. So last year, before COVID hit, I remember being on roundtables in India talking about the importance of non-traditional security in the Indo-Pacific, and being told quite strongly, no, Indo-Pacific means security, and security means maritime defence. And that was just taken as given. To Erin's point, I also feel that gender and maybe not youth, but the perception of youth is also part of that. So I'm perceived to be a young woman in the field.
It's just a good skincare regime.
But certainly, I think, you know, not having a deep voice, these things matter in a circle, and they shouldn't. So this goes to Sylvia's point, perhaps of diction, but just the amount of gravitas one can create in a room, depending on what we associate characteristics of being convincing or power to be. So of course, now in a post-COVID environment, I'd been speaking about the importance of water security, health security, agricultural security, cyber security, all these aspects of non-traditional security, and even climate change and its impact on these elements of security, including personal security and refugee crises, none of which was taken up. Now, as the world moves more and more strongly into the cyber world, as mobility becomes constrained, connectivity, as we can see today, has never been stronger. But then cyber attacks have never been stronger either. And this is something that the Australian government has had to respond to. Part of the virtual summit between Prime Ministers Morrison and Modi spoke about having an agreement on cybersecurity. So non-traditional security is almost our biggest threat. And what I find almost ironic or perhaps amusing is that if this is a so-called female perspective, it's actually one that is forward-looking and addressing the 21st century issues of today, not being quagmired in 20th century issues. We're willing to engage in the issues that matter currently, and I think more needs to be done to think about how we can break old patterns, because doing what we've always done in the way that we've always done it and using that kind of discourse hasn't really moved or advanced humanity forward. And I think for me, that's the biggest stumbling block. So for Sylvia's earliest point about the diversity of voices helping to change and change discourse, change theory, and hopefully change direction, I'd love to see a real breakthrough on humanity, inclusion, and a positive 21st century that takes us away from the paradigm of traditional trade and security.
Thank you, Tanya. That was something which we also discuss a lot personally in our office, as you know, how while we are moving ahead in time, people are still thinking about only conventional forms of security and how non-traditional security, and you as a woman talking about it, are in fact more forward-looking than being stuck into a position like say for instance health today, the pandemic, you know, no one had foreseen it, but this is a non-traditional security threat, and it's high time we don't just see women as you know, someone who will only talk about say climate or sustainability. And of course these things are very, very important, but you know, a perspective which keeps people in different blocks or tries to contain how individuals or their gender is something that we need to do away with. And I think that's exactly what this conversation here is doing today with all of us.
No, indeed. And I think, I mean, even this post-pandemic, I was on a conference with Supichai Panich-Pakdi, a former Director General of the World Trade Organization. And when I suggested that the World Trade Organization might need to be more positive about health and environmental issues, right now, when you talk about trade, you can have exceptions under Article 20 of the GATT, but these are exceptions to trade liberalisation. You can't force, you know, a more positive trade obligation on environment and health. So you can't mandate that something must be environmental or promotive of health. These things are currently exceptions. But the response was still, well, health is not trade related and WTO only deals with trade related things.
Huh.
To which I said,
Except
well,
if
that's
it's a national
interesting.
security issue. So
Well, also that our global supply
India
chain.
and Brazil have both used Article, I think it's 10 on national security exceptions to try to mass manufacture generic versions of drugs for large diseases, which guess what, if there's a vaccine, somebody's going to be manufacturing it off-label.
Exactly.
And the people that have been talking about health security and global health coordination are of both genders. I can think of Adam Cameron Scott here in Australia and Claire Wenham in Britain, and they've just not been listened to. So anybody who's primed to listen to issues which we traditionally think of as alternative or progressive forms of security, they've been there this whole time. It's just that they haven't been listened to. And now that something has happened, everybody in their traditional security lens is going, oh God, this was unpredictable. No, it wasn't, you just weren't listening. So that feels very familiar.
Yes, so thank you all for being here. I'm sure Tanya would like to give a vote of thanks to all of you for being here. It was a very nice conversation. I surely enjoyed it, and I'll hand it over to Tanya now.
Thank you very much. And I deeply appreciate, first of all, Erin Watson-Lynn and Carla Winston both joining us from Australia. It's now close to 10 p.m. So it's very, very kind and committed of you to give your time. Sylvia joining us from the United States in Washington, D.C., where we really hope for a positive outcome of the US election in November. And to Parul Nada, thank you for a brilliant moderating session. And we look forward to you emerging into this field as a woman in international relations in your own right. So I think it's been a really interesting session, covered a wide array of issues, and I very much hope that all of you on the panel may be able to stay in touch on issues of interest. Thank you.